You're watching the show that puts Mid-Michigan news in focus. This is Focal Point.
Hello everyone, I'm Amanda Shadnicki.
And I'm Miguel Martinez Valle.
On this edition of Focal Point, we will explore some topics making headlines in race, ethnicity, and gender identity.
For the next half hour, we'll take you into the lives of some of the people in these communities and help give more understanding to the struggles they are facing.
Making the decision to transition is easier for some people and harder on others. And some people even spend the first half of their life as a different gender.
Tonight, we listen to what the controversial term white privilege means and how it affects some people's lives.
As a whole, we're playing catch up.
Tejano, Hispanic, Chicana, all words that represent Latinos and Latinas, but some MSU students still struggle with the question of, what are you?
I definitely identify as Chicano, and in a broader context, I am Latino, right? And so I identify también with the broader Latino community.
And African Americans in the Lansing community speak out on identity and their African roots.
Black is everything that white isn't.
We have the answers to the questions people have been asking about some hot-button topics in the media that are affecting minorities here in Mid-Michigan. Focal Point starts now.
First on tonight's show, they're on the covers of magazines, can be seen walking the red carpet, and may even be standing right next to you on the street.
About 700,000 transgender people live in the United States. That means those who have transitioned from male to female or female to male. Recently, former Olympic athlete and current reality TV star Bruce Jenner announced publicly that he is transgender.
Focal Point's Marley Delaney joins us now. Marley, you talked to about 3 transgendered people. What did you learn from their experiences?
Well, some people spend half of their lives as a different gender, and some people begin their transition at a young age. And although there are many struggles involved in the process, most can agree that becoming a transgender individual has made them happier. James Danger and Calvin Murphy are friends that share a common bond. They are both female to male transgender individuals in the state of Michigan.
For me, socially, I came out when I was, I want to say 23.
I came out as trans to my closest friends when I was 19. I'm 22 now.
Coming out as transgender means that both James and Calvin were born female, but now identify as male.
Honestly, I thought something was wrong with me. I knew I was different. I knew that I wasn't fitting in with the girls and I wasn't fitting in with the guys, but I mostly just felt like I was just an outcast.
And it wasn't until James and Calvin were in their teens did they finally learn what it meant to be transgender.
Because I just was kind of figured I would just be unhappy forever, and that was just how life was going to be,
Calvin said he didn't know that he could be transgender and still like pink and glitter.
The trans narrative that you typically see is, I never wore dresses and I literally set my pink bedroom on fire and stuff like that. I wasn't like that at all. So it took me a while to figure out that I was still allowed to be trans. But eventually I figured it out.
Making the decision to transition is easier for some people and harder on others. And some people even spend the first half of their life as a different gender. Jay Elbrecht always felt more masculine, but he waited until he was 40 years old to begin his transition into a male.
I was the youngest of 5 kids, and my dad was a Korean War veteran, and he had all his uniforms in a trunk in the attic, and guess who would get into his uniforms and play soldier?
Jay said that as he got older, he felt like his body wasn't developing into what he thought it would be.
Puberty is just a cruel joke on trans people. I became so uncomfortable with my body, and actually society became so uncomfortable with me.
Not only are transgender individuals struggling with accepting themselves, it's an uphill battle gaining acceptance from society.
I think the media needs to be ashamed of themselves.
The media is blowing up these people who may put a different perspective on us that not a lot of us agree with to begin with.
James says that it's giving people the wrong ideas and the wrong stereotypes, and he wishes there was a better light and a better spokesperson for the transgender population.
I am so deeply honored to be here today.
In addition to the struggle of self-acceptance and social acceptance, transgender individuals oftentimes lose the people they're closest to.
I haven't talked to my dad in 2.5 years, and I haven't seen him. I haven't seen my mom in like a year.
It's just frustrating for me that people that freaking loved me before I transitioned are now like actively trying to piss me off.
And Calvin says that about 40% of trans people attempt suicide in their lifetime. Calvin and James actually lost somebody to suicide this past December.
You know, it's very difficult to be surrounded by that and knowing how real the consequences can be.
A lot of times in finding yourself, you're going to lose certain people, but just don't ever lose yourself.
James is active on YouTube, making motivational videos that inspire trans people around the world.
He played one of my YouTube videos at his school for his teacher and his classes to see, and they want him to do an assembly.
After he shared James's video, his classmates learned to respect his transition because they could finally understand what he was going through.
For me to just help this little boy at 15 years old go through one of the hardest times in your life, being trans and in high school, like, I don't know, that in itself is motivation for me to want to continue doing what I'm doing.
And as far as how to approach a transgender individual, Calvin and Jay offer some advice.
There's no reason for you to ask them any personal questions the first time you meet them.
It's a very private, personal thing.
And for those who may be transgender but are not open about it,
there's other people out there that can help you and other people that are there for you, that have been through it, that are going through it, that are waiting to go through it.
James, Calvin, and Jay want you to know that you are not alone. You can find James's motivational YouTube videos on the Transactive YouTube channel at youtube.com/transactivevideos.
And coming up, people are working for a racism-free community by educating others on what white privilege is.
And Focal Point will take you inside the books that help bust biases in 100 questions.
Who is willing to do what it takes? Work harder, work smarter, forge uncommon partnerships, all to solve global problems for the common good. Who will? Spartans will.
While black people make up about 30% of the U.S. population, they represent about 60% of all people in prison. Startling to some, many believe this is one example of white privilege. It has been a hot issue in the media more now than ever, and we explore what that phrase means and why it still exists.
Yeah, I've definitely heard of the term white privilege before, specifically on Twitter.
The phrase white privilege, used by the media after recent events such as the riots and protests in Ferguson, Baltimore, and other cities across the U.S.
I don't want to be like, if it wasn't for Twitter, I wouldn't have heard about it, but it probably would have been like a later process.
The hashtag white privilege is now trending on Twitter, making the issue more well known.
And white privilege is, because we are the dominant culture, we experience privileges, and certain privileges because of the color of our skin.
It doesn't make me feel any less than, what I am.
Yeah. Lisa Mitchell, the director of Partners for a Racism-Free Community, or PRFC, says some examples of statements from someone with white privilege may be
like, oh, why are we still talking about race? Mm-hmm. That would be a statement that clue you in that there's some white privilege going on. Or, oh, now we have a black president in the White House. Why are we dealing with this?
Linda Quist, the Director of Finance and Development at PRFC, says as a white person living in America, she unknowingly uses her white privilege every day.
I never got pulled over in 2 years of driving there, and I was speeding every day because I was late every day. But I would see almost every day somebody was pulled over, and it was never a white person.
Quist says another example of white privilege is to not have to worry about being followed in a store.
Even Oprah Winfrey was followed in a high-end clothing store because they didn't recognize that she was Oprah. But it was because of the color of her skin. You and I are never going to experience that.
Charles Johnson is a front desk manager at the East Lansing Marriott, and he says he's been a victim of racial profiling while shopping in an expensive store.
I happen to like Burberry, so I walk into the store, and most people would be greeted, right at the door, and sort of had their hand held as they walked through the store as potential buyers. And I would walk through, go to the front, walk through the back without being greeted.
However, he, along with MSU sophomore Tyrese Brewington, say they're just used to this treatment.
I mean, it doesn't, I think I'm pretty immune to it at this point, just because, I mean, I don't think it really bothers me that much, but I don't know, I just don't pick up on it as much now because it's,
Blacks aren't the only ones who have to struggle with this. Quist uses those from the Middle East as an example of those who were targeted after 9/11.
You can be pretty assured as a white person that you're not going to be stopped and frisked. You're not going to get into that altercation. People are not going to judge you as an example of your race.
But people like Quist and Mitchell from PRFC want those of color to know this isn't just their battle.
We feel compelled, I feel compelled to work towards eliminating it.
It's a battle that has taken place for quite some time, a battle Johnson wants to end.
I have a niece who's 10 years old. I don't want my niece to grow up thinking about, her being a young little black girl. She just needs to worry about being a girl.
Encouraging those to remember America's past.
9/11, never forget. Holocaust, never forget. But get over slavery? Again, that's white supremacy and white privilege.
Quist and Mitchell are working to educate others on why white privilege exists.
I don't know if it exists or not. A lot of people think it does, but I don't know.
And how to work toward a world without it.
What we should be looking to move towards is a life in a society where those prejudices are not there.
PRFC offers workshops on understanding white privilege for the general public, as well as ones on institutional racism for both businesses and their employees.
We all know couple Kim Kardashian and Kanye West, but other than being A-list celebrities, they're also an interracial couple.
Ariel Rumbert will tell us how these relationships are becoming more and more common.
Thanks, Amanda. Well, during most of U.S. history, interracial marriage has been banned. Even though now it's more common, everyone is not willing to accept it.
Forgot to say you were cute.
Every love story has its fair share of jokes, romantic walks, and of course,
He kissed me.
kisses. Couples pushing racial limits have become more familiar in the U.S.
Whether it's just like that indirect stare or I see the wheels turning when they look at Garrett, they're not sure what race he is.
Everyday dates like grabbing a bite to eat or catching a movie with your significant other can be difficult when you're being stigmatized by the public. Joy and Garrett have been dating for about 3 months. And up close, you may not be able to tell them apart.
You can kind of tell right now when I get the mini fro going and stuff that I'm half black. Garrett
is a resident assistant and former intercultural aide. He says at a young age, he remembers being judged while with his parents.
Growing up with my dad being black and my mom being white, I noticed that a lot of sometimes people would look and just sort of, I could tell they were recognizing thinking are they together or not and things like that.
Timeless stereotypes can play a part in creating that cultural barrier.
Well, one that just pertains to me might be since I'm the white female, my white father might not approve.
1 of every 7 U.S. marriages today are interracial. And a new Pew Research study shows marrying out of one's race is most common among Hispanics and Asians.
The Koreans are actually very exclusive.
Meet Abby and Justin. This couple and others like it make up about 8% of all marriage in the U.S.
Then we've been married for 10 months.
But today's the 24th, 10 months tomorrow. Exactly.
And life for the newlyweds have its trials due to racial differences, starting with family.
So I had a conversation with my mom about 2 years ago. My wife either had to be Korean or make 7 figures a year or have a PhD.
She thinks that I'm supposed to just step up and take her place as mother, and I'm not your mom, I'm your wife.
Apparently race is not the only issue. Culture also plays a role.
I entered into this relationship knowing full well that I might have to break away and disown from my family.
Love has no color, race, or ethnicity.
just like all great, you know, movements and progression and things like that has to start somewhere.
Hopefully. We'll see a day where it's just normal and like it's just two people who are happy or that fit or get along.
Social stigmas may never die,
There's still a lot of work to do.
but with time, they will certainly fade.
Since the 1980s, interracial couples have more than doubled in number in the U.S., and it's still continuing to grow.
We've all heard and used the terms African American, African, and Black.
But what we may not know is how people of color prefer to be identified. Focal Point's Daniela Bruce learned more about the topic.
Generation Africans may not necessarily like being called African American because they're actually African, right? And
Theodore Ransaw of African American and African Studies at MSU says that many people do not understand how complicated a label can be.
even if you are a second generation African, which means you're from Africa but born in the United States, do you still want to be necessarily construed or considered being African American? So there's some dichotomy issues on both sides.
Elra Radney, a PhD student in African American and African Studies, specializes in identity issues.
There's a whole history of struggle and discourse or conversation associated with, well, how we got to African American.
Ransaw says there are different opinions on what term correctly identifies blacks or African Americans.
You may have some people are actually thinking, well, maybe it was better off for us to be called colored, or maybe it's better off for us to be called black and not necessarily African American, right? But then some folks are like, well, maybe we shouldn't be African American, maybe we should just be Americans. So that pendulum is swinging back and forth.
Both Ransaw and Radney say that white privilege, whether whites realize it or not, has had many negative effects on how African Americans identify themselves.
Supremacy, racism, white privilege has an interconnected relationship, okay? And its justification and rationalization has created a supportive epistemic, a supportive way of knowing that in turn has created a shame-based overview, right, on claiming African heritage or African as an identifier.
Radney said white privilege also causes many issues for biracial people.
The problem that happens for the most part is that unless you really understand racism, right, usually one doesn't have a problem with embracing their white side, right? The problem really still lies in embracing the black side.
Which Radney says shows the negativity tied to the term black.
Black is everything that white isn't.
Radney also said that a geological disconnect may contribute to African American identity confusion.
It is a legitimate cultural inflection that denotes a certain kind of experience in the gumbo of America's amalgamations of ethnicities, race, struggle, and culture.
Radney believes this is an important thing to remember.
Being African American also is not a denial of your American citizenship.
Tiffany Caesar is also a PhD student in African American and African Studies. She believes more research can help this issue and encourages people who are interested in the subject to look into AAAS.
Really a great space for people who are interested in creating research that advances cultural knowledge on Black people globally.
But even with further research,
I don't anticipate it being something that's going to be solved anytime soon. And I do know that there have been some very serious conversations about that. And I don't see there being any end in sight.
For Focal Point, I'm Daniela Bruce.
Next, we have an interview with the MSU professor behind the books that helped shape some of tonight's show.
And MSU has seen a spike in Chinese international students, creating a cultural divide with some Americans. But one Chinese student says all they need to overcome this divide is some courage.
Who will push the boundaries of discovery every day? Embrace partnerships that lead to better answers, all to make a bigger impact on lives around the world. Who will? Spartans will.
Stereotypes and biases have always been a part of our society. And even though today we are much more aware of the people around us, perpetuating these views continues to be a problem. I had the opportunity to sit down with one Michigan State professor working with students to educate people on things that may otherwise go misunderstood.
Try me on Brian.
Joe Grimm is a professor in the School of Journalism at MSU
Come see me again. I want to know how you're doing.
and a former recruiter at the Detroit Free Press. Every semester, Grimm and a group of students work to produce a series of books aimed at people looking to learn about different cultures. Through the guides, students help to bust bias and expand overall cultural competency.
The idea is that there's a lot of questions that people have about people of other cultures that they might be afraid to ask because they don't want to seem dumb, or they don't want to ask them because they're afraid they might offend somebody.
What are some of the main goals of the series?
The main goal of the series really is to get people, get our readers to the point where they can have a conversation with people they know. We hope that by eliminating some of the easy questions in a way that is not embarrassing, they'll feel more confident to go ahead and ask more questions.
And what kind of questions do they ask?
They're pretty basic questions. The questions come from interviews that students do with members of those groups to ask them, what is it that you wish people knew about you? So a question could be something like, oh, let's see, what goes on inside a synagogue or a mosque? If a person hasn't been there, they might not have any idea, or they might say, what is the rule about shoes in a mosque? Maybe they've heard about it but never experienced it.
What made you start this series?
The series, the first guide in the series was one I did in the 80s at the Detroit Free Press when I was trying to share information about the Arab American community, which was visiting me at the Free Press and telling me frequently what we were getting wrong. I made a guide then, and I thought this would be a great time to update that guide and create a whole series of them using the talents of Michigan State students.
So what are some of the difficulties that you've had producing these books and that your students have had producing these books?
Well, I think we all go through a kind of a nervous period. The students are nervous. They say, gosh, I have to talk to a bunch of people who I'm not that familiar with, and I have to ask them some personal questions sometimes. And so that can be a little nerve-wracking. And I always have a moment during each project where I doubt that we can, I say, what made me think that we could do 100 questions and answers about Muslims?
So how do you prep some of the students in very sensitive topics such as religion?
That's a good question. Frequently we have people from the Michigan Department of Civil Rights come over and talk with us about how to have difficult conversations or how to ask awkward questions. We love to have people come in and talk to the class. We had Muhammad Khalil come in and talk to us about Muslims. He's a professor here. Alan Gale came in and met with the class, and Alan brought in some objects for the students to look at and to talk about. We also go out. We'll go to mosques, synagogues. We'll sort of visit places where some of the answers might be. So it's a little here, a little there.
What type of response have you gotten from these guides?
Well, the response I always worry about is somebody will hate it. And so far that hasn't happened. We're always very concerned about getting things wrong. That's the last thing we want to do in a guide like this. But a lot of the responses come from people who read about themselves and they say, oh, that was pretty interesting. I didn't know people had that question about me. Or they might say, you know, I never really knew why we did that. And so a lot of the responses are about people being enlightened.
What have you gained from this experience personally?
Well, I've learned a whole lot about team building and collaboration. On every guide we do, we have, of course, the students, and each member of the class and the professor must interview 3 or 4 or more people from the group to ask them what questions you think should be answered. And then we have another circle of people who help us by writing introductory material like forewords and prefaces and introductions, and the people who talk to the class. And then there's another circle of people who are experts and who read the guides to tell us if we got them right. They'll not only read the questions we come up with, but they'll also read the questions with the answers after we come up with those answers.
So what qualifies you to produce these books? Do you have any qualifications that you do hands-on that
produce?
I have no qualifications. I tell the students that one of their greatest strengths is their ignorance about a subject. So if there's a subject they don't know about, I say that's perfect. You just have to be curious and courageous and ask the question that you wonder about. And then I rely on the experts, who are a diverse group of experts in and of themselves. We always have men and women of different ages and perspectives to read these guides, and then we have to take their suggestions and try to rectify all of that. And it really makes the final product pretty authoritative, I think.
How do you hope that these guides bring a better understanding to misunderstood cultures?
Well, I hope, all we can really hope to do with these guides, they run about 80 pages, 70 pages. All we can really hope is that we put people on a start. And I hope we do that by clearing off the questions that are barriers to having conversations. In the Indian Americans Guide, one of the questions is, what does that dot mean that some people have on their forehead? And that's pretty much how we express the question, because that's how a lot of people ask it. And we hope that once a person reads the answer, they'll say, well, good, I don't need to ask about that anymore.
This fall, Joe Grimm will produce the next book in the series, 100 Questions and Answers About African Americans. You can buy any book in the series on Amazon.com. Miguel, Amanda?
Thank you, Ariel. You know, I always wanted to take that class but never got to. Did you take it, Amanda?
I didn't, Miguel, I didn't, but it always seemed very interesting to learn about cultures other than your own, so I wish I would have.
Yeah. When we hear the word stereotype, we often associate a certain type of clothing, music, or food with a group of people.
Yeah, and later some MSU students and faculty will bring some topics that are covered in these Bias Buster guides to life.
Ever wonder where courage comes from? Where one finds the strength to believe in solutions that seem impossible? It takes a Spartan's will to understand that by working together we can solve the world's biggest problems, from renewable energy to fighting malaria. After all, if we don't do it, who will? Spartans will.
In the fall of 2014, international students consisted of about 15% of the student body at Michigan State University.
Tonight, we discover how these students have adapted to college life in America. April Jones gives us a little more insight in the life of these Michigan State international students.
I talked with some Chinese students about the culture divide they face and how one American student is teaming up with others to help bridge the gap.
I'd say that they're all math majors or engineering majors.
I'm not good at math. They aren't really interested in learning like English. They're like, oh God, you speak English, they're surprised.
Those are just some of the common misconceptions that Journalism International freshman Mayoko Iwata hear on a daily basis. And with the increase of international students at Michigan State University,
since 2006, there has been a 500% increase in the number of Chinese international students.
Those stereotypes are gradually spreading. Chinese student Shou Yu Wen, who goes by the name of Frankie, said he was excited to mix in Americans' melting pot. However, upon arriving to the States, he discovered a cultural divide.
Asians are kind of shy to talk to Americans, and they are kind of afraid of talking to them.
Communication is the biggest barrier.
Jerry Zeldes is a journalism professor at MSU who recently produced the documentary Imported from China, where they followed 2 international students around for 3 years.
It captures how they have difficulties in navigating American life and life on campus.
According to MSU International reports, 1 in 11 MSU students are from China, but instead of mixing together with the domestic population, many are seeking companionship with their own culture or other international students.
The majority do self-isolate.
If I have 2 friendships from different countries, that will be kind of like tough. So if I have a party, I don't know who I need to invite. If I invite my Chinese people and my American people, they have the difficulty to communicate.
The way of talking or thinking or the expression or the clothes that we're wearing, it's kind of a little bit different from American students.
Despite the culture divide here at Michigan State University between the Eastern Asia International and the American domestic students, there's one organization in particular who makes it their mission to bring these two groups together.
Our group is an international and domestic student-led group that's meant to build bridges across cultures.
Ashley Raw is the vice president of the International Domestic Exchange Association, and she says it's her passion to mix MSU students together, whether they come from the same background or not.
MSU has a lot of international students. There's a lot of domestic students, and the international students and the domestic students have a hard time like building friendships and like seeing past like cultural things.
Raw said the group goes on various gatherings and field trips where they step out of their own boundaries and into each other's shoes.
The world is becoming more globalized, and we're not going to be able to stay in a little American bubble for very long.
We need to understand the more like specific details of American culture. Then American students needs to try to understand more other world cultures.
I want people to be comfortable on campus, and a lot of international students, like, they're not exactly the most like welcomed group on campus.
To just like to abolish the barrier between American and Chinese is to give them courage.
To communicate with each other so that stereotypes can vanish and students can become united as Spartans together. Students on campus may speak different languages and represent countries all around the world, but we all have something in common. We are Spartans, and Spartans will stand together.
It's no secret that the influence of Hispanic culture is growing in the United States. In fact, Spanish is the second most widely spoken language in most of the U.S. While there are many programs at MSU that help Latinos find a sense of self-identity, this may not be the only barrier standing in their way. With a population of over 50 million and growing, Latinos are the largest minority living in the U.S., and I talked with some fellow Spartans about what the important issues are in the Latino community today. People are asked to label themselves every day.
I definitely identify myself as Mexicano.
I'm from Michigan, so I consider myself a Michicana.
And I would definitely also identify myself as Ecuadorian.
Depending on the context and where I am, who's asking and why, I would say that I'm definitely Chicano.
Labels such as Chicano, Latino, or Hispanic categorize the largest minority group in the country.
And in a broader context, I am Latino, right?
Cristian Ramirez is a Mexican-American PhD student at Michigan State University. For him, as for many other Latinos or Hispanics, identity is an important issue. The terms Latino versus Hispanic can be used interchangeably, but people have different preferences.
I think that this is something that has to do with how each of us see ourselves.
Dr. Manuel Chavez, a professor at MSU, usually identifies as Hispanic, but is comfortable with either term.
I don't mind that a Puerto Rican tells me that he's a Puerto Rican and he's a Latino instead of a Hispanic. I don't feel offended by it. But for many, this is a very hot issue.
The issue of identity is one of the many topics taught under MSU's Chicano Latino Studies, or CLS program.
Knowing that information, that you're not a citizen of the country that you live in, sort of shapes your identity.
CLS is offered as a minor or PhD program, and it aims to help people understand not only the modern role of Latinos in the United States, but their presence, influence, and issues throughout the nation's history. Issues that differ from Latino to Latino.
And that's why we have to kind of treat it differently. If you look at Puerto Ricans, they have U.S. citizenship. And so when you group Puerto Ricans with the rest of us, they're like, yeah, I'm Latino. They're very proud to be Latino.
Esmeralda Perez de Lopez is an undergraduate advisor for CLS.
And I think everybody's pretty proud to be Latino, but they definitely have a very special status that the rest of us don't.
It is this lack of status that leads to one of the most heavily talked about issues surrounding Latinos in the U.S.
Not only Congress, but the White House are going to need to agree in what to do about the 11 million plus immigrants who are here in the country undocumented.
While immigration reform is still in a kind of limbo, there are programs such as Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which allow immigrant youth to attend school, but don't necessarily address other issues.
Issues facing our people are access to services, to monies, a lot of people, especially students, have a hard time finding money for college.
Despite the opportunities to be able to do a mobility from the lower classes or the middle class or the lower middle class to move up due to education, the Latino enrollment and the Latino success and graduation rates has been completely flat.
So while there are still many issues facing Latinos and barriers to overcome, the largest minority group in the U.S. is growing not only in size, but in influence.
What I think is that for the next election is the first tacit and explicit demonstration of the power of the Latino vote.
It's this growing power that Latinos or Hispanics or whatever the individual's preferred term is are using to make their presence felt and their impact known. Over 25 million Latinos are able to vote this year, and with a strong voter turnout in 2016, it's possible Latinos will be the decisive factor in that election.
We hope you enjoyed this special edition of Focal Point, discussing the cultural issues facing Americans every day. I'm Amanda Chadnicki.
And I'm Miguel Martinez Valle. Thank you for watching, and see you next time on Focal Point.